Hello, Ferdinand.
Hello.
You are both a philosophical practitioner and a psychologist in Helsinki, in Finland.
That's right.
And you do both group activity and individual counseling or therapy, right?
That is true. That is true.
So I was wondering, how do you combine together, if you combine at all, the philosophical elements and the psychological elements in your work with individuals?
So just sort of to give a little bit more background, sort of in terms of my professional training and my experiences with philosophical practice. Just to clarify, I don't have any specific training on philosophical practice, but we've been doing this with an organization called Interbaas for a number of years in Finland. Different types of activities within philosophical practice, such as philosophy cafés, working with philosophy in schools, and then also Socratic dialogues and things like this. And as part of that, we've sort of been affiliated a little bit with the movement for philosophical practice internationally and participated in various workshops and things. And then apart from that, I'm a trained clinical psychologist in Finland, and I've been involved in crisis and trauma work for a number of years. So I've been doing working with the Red Cross both nationally and internationally in disasters and things like this. And then professionally in Helsinki, I work for the Rehabilitation Center for Torture Survivors. So I work with refugees and asylum seekers on trauma rehabilitation and trauma therapy on a day-to-day basis. Yeah.
So you're a psychologist, but you combine philosophical elements in your work.
Yes, I do. In terms of this, I think it's been a very good learning experience for me to be involved in these, both in the sort of academic philosophical training, as well as sort of being involved in the philosophical practice activities of different types for my clinical practice. That's very much my experience. That's true for both kind of the group counseling and the individual counseling activities we've done. And I think there's been many ways of sort of combining and learning from each of these fields and incorporating that into the activities of the other.
Can you give an example of a person you worked with where there were both philosophical and psychological elements?
I think there's quite a few people, like sort of when you talk about sort of people who are in crisis, that's sort of one part of it. And then the other are people who have experienced severe trauma. I think sort of a big question, for example, with people who was involved in a number of the sort of the peer support for relatives of the victims of the school shootings in Finland. With those, we worked with them with peer support groups for 2 years afterwards with the Red Cross. And in that work, I think sort of some of the big questions are around sort of the intentionality of the acts that happened. And then you run in a lot into the kind of questions we talked about here at the international conference today about forgiveness, for example, as well as the questions of hope, especially for elderly grandparents and things like this. If they've lost their grandchildren, it's difficult for them to rebuild hope and hope in people in general. But also the questions of forgiveness and kind of the questions of right to anger, for example, and restitution and things like this. And that's, I think, there you're sort of very close to the kind of ethical issues that you deal with in philosophical practice. And I think that's a good example where the kind of the training in philosophy and philosophical practice can give you the sort of the ethical basis to actually address these issues with people in crisis.
Can you give a specific example without identifying details of one of those grandparents or parents that you worked with?
I think sort of just a general sort of from these groups. I think one issue which comes up is a lot the question of anger and sort of the question of restitution in a sense, where there is there's a general feeling that somebody should somehow pay for the damages in a sense, and as in the cases in Finland, the person who, the shooter, in both cases committed suicide. It is the question. Then the question is, who can sort of? There's nobody who, the responsible person has passed away, so there's nobody who's sort of responsible for paying the damages, and then sort of responsibility goes back to the government or authorities or some other people. And of course, with situations and disasters and things like this, there's nobody who can adequately repay somebody for these losses.
So would you say that one issue that comes up, one philosophical issue that comes up, is the justice in the world, that some terrible things have been done and there is nobody to blame, alive at least?
Exactly. That's sort of one sort of part of it. The question of justice in the world, which is sort of a general sort of existential issue, but also sort of, in a sense, there is the question of the kind of a right to negative emotions such as anger or hostility, I think, in general, which is, I think that's sort of that it's a right to carry these negative emotions, I think, is an important sort of learning point from philosophical practice to the clinical work, where sort of these kind of emotions are generally seen as something which is maybe something that people should preferably get over and get rid of as soon as possible.
So let's say that I am a parent or a grandparent of of someone who died in a school shooting, and I say, you know, I feel this anger, and I know that it's wrong to feel this anger, but I just feel it. So what kind of philosophical issues or dialogue would follow?
But I think the question is sort of then, is it right or wrong? Okay. Instead of sort of exploring whether it's sort of, you could explore if it's right or wrong, of course, but I think sort of a better approach is kind of to explore what are the kind of the consequences of it, and sort of exploring what are the consequences of anger, of this anger that the person is carrying and have the right to carry, in a sense. It's not. I don't think it's right and wrong, but they do have consequences. And then the question is, are you prepared to take the responsibility for these consequences if you want to carry the anger and you think it's justified? Then that has certain consequences for you and for those around you. Or would you then prefer to do something about it, get rid of this anger or change the situation somehow? But I think that's sort of a kind of an existential choice that people make. And I think these sort of existential choices are the kind of things which you can sort of reveal through sort of using elements of philosophical counseling within the clinical practice.
Very interesting. So when you say an existential choice, you mean, I understand, what kind of a person am I going to be, or do I want to be? Someone who keeps anger within me, or someone who does something else? Another
example, this could be, for example, when you work with refugees and asylum seekers who've experienced torture or severe violence, for example. The question there is, many people harbor sort of feelings of revenge, for example, towards those who did wrong to them. And there is the question again that it's not, these feelings are justified. These feelings are justified, and it's related to sort of feeling powerless and so on. But the risk sort of in sort of, if you go into a very sort of typically clinical approach, is that you then sort of psychologize these things, and then you relate it to the powerlessness that you felt at the moment when this happened, and so on and so on, and then it becomes sort of a something to be solved, a problem to be solved. But there is also sort of the kind of or at least I feel that there's sort of this right to want revenge. But then there's also the question then of sort of thinking through, what does that imply? What does it imply if I carry, on the one hand, if I carry through this plan? That's sort of one part of it. What kind of consequences does it have for me? What kind of consequences does it have for my family, for example, and so on and so on. On the other hand, you have sort of the perspective of if it's not realistic to do it, what kind of consequences does it have to sort of harbor these kind of thoughts of revenge all the time, every day? and what does that sort of, what happens to me in that situation? And I think that's, but it's sort of it comes back to is sort of not pathologizing this kind of wishes or thoughts, but rather to sort of pose it kind of sort of as a question to clarify. I mean, this is an option, let's say, in the clinical practices to kind of clarify the field. This is where we're at. These are the choices. These are the consequences of these feelings, and then sort of identifying where do you want to go from here.
Okay. So the question is not psychologized away, but it's a legitimate question about where do I want to go, what kind of a person I want to be, what kind of behavior. So it's really an existential issue.
I think so, yeah. And what easily I think happens is sort of, or can happen, it depends, I guess, on both on the person and on the particular clinician, and sort of the approach that is used is sort of that the issues, you sort of have more, there is the risk, at least in sort of clinical practice, that there is kind of this normalizing or medicalizing or prescriptive approach where sort of certain types of feelings are labeled as problematic, and then because they're problematic from a clinical perspective, you try to get rid of them. I don't know, I think that's a tricky issue somehow in that. And I think that's something I've learned from the philosophical approach and taken into my clinical practice.
Interesting, very interesting. So to what extent did your encounter with philosophy, either readings or conversations that you had with other philosophers, to what extent did it help you to enrich or deepen the conversation on the philosophical element, the existential element, with your clients?
I think it's difficult for me to separate because I did actually study philosophy at the same time as I studied psychology. So it's not, I haven't sort of gone from one field to the other, but it's something which is sort of simultaneous. I think I don't use sort of philosophical references in my discussions. I don't use them as sources for the discussion. And what I don't do sort of in my clinical practice, I don't do, how should I say, I don't go to the level of abstraction in a sense as clearly as I think some other practitioners do. I sort of stay within the subjective and the individual in a sense. But I think sort of the background in that allows one to have a perspective on these issues, which is a sort of a step away from sort of a purely psychological approach.
Okay. Well, very interesting, Ferdinand. Very interesting.